Good evening and welcome to Opportunity China's second pre-departure webinar. My name is Will Perrins, the Partnership and Recruitment Manager for Opportunity China. It's a pleasure to join you all again today. Welcome back to those of you who were able to join us yesterday, and welcome for the first time those of you who are joining us today. Many of you may have noticed an email dropping into your accounts today with information on yesterday's webinar, a link to watch it, as well as a reading list with a lot of useful information and the slides that were used from yesterday's webinar as well. If you've yet to read the email, please do take a look at that and take a look at the information pack that is attached to it. It's full of really useful information and guides that will help you through the pre-departure stage. As with yesterday, we have our chat box open and ready to be used for any questions that you might have. There will be ample opportunity in between the sections of our slides for me to answer any questions that you might have in there. However, there can sometimes be a little bit of a delay or a lag on the stream itself. So if I don't answer anything in there, then an Opportunity China coordinator is on chat today as well to be able to answer anything for you there as well. Well, today we're really going to be diving into what it means to be a foreign teacher in China. So yesterday we were looking at what to expect before you arrive, just after you arrive, and generally what life is going to be like for you as a foreigner arriving in China for the first time. Today, we're going to be getting a little bit more into the education and professional side of your life in China. This is, of course, going to be an incredibly important aspect of your life in China, as it's, well, what you're going to be there to do. We are going to be taking a look at a few different aspects of it. But first of all, let's have a quick sneak peek at the type of role you're going to be having. Well, first of all, there are the classes that you will teach and the students that will learn from you. The classes that you'll teach in China will really vary depending on the different type of school or institution you're going to be working at. For this year's graduate program, we've got roughly a 50-50 split between public schools in China and private language centers. Some of you will be giving what will essentially be lectures in front of 40 to 60 students. Others of you may predominantly have between 1 and 5 students in your class each week. Some of you will be teaching middle schoolers, even a few of you a little bit older than that, who will be learning more complex vocabulary, who will be sitting down and learning really quite intricate details of language from you each day. Others of you will have children as young as 3 or 4 at kindergarten who will be having their very formative education taught by you, who will be having a very vibrant and lively experience whilst you're teaching in China. There's going to be a huge amount of diversity in the classes that you're going to teach and the types of rooms that you're going to have as well. There are the places that you're going to work. As I've mentioned, we've got a roughly 50-50 split here. But many of you can expect to be working in a bright, breezy, large environment. In China, when it comes to both public schools and also private language centers, a huge amount is invested in education. A huge amount is invested in the area in which students are expected to learn. It's going to be something that's going to be very different from the smaller, more enclosed, arguably more communal classroom experiences that we have in the West. It's going to be very different. Those of you who are going to be working in private language centers expect to find lots of brightly colored tables and lots of brightly colored teaching aids. Expect to be working in a much more informal setting, sometimes even on beanbags in rooms. Those of you who are going to be working in public schools expect something very different. Expect single desks for the students, all sat in rows facing you, not on tables, communally talking with one another. This is going to be a very different sort of experience to anything you might have had before, and it's important to prepare yourself for it, whether you're in a language center or whether you are at a public school. Also, the place that you're going to work is very much going to be a home from home for you for the next year. It's going to be a place where many of your colleagues and many of your friends are going to work. It's going to be a place where you'll have your own spot, your own area in an office, where you'll have your own supplies. It's very much going to be an important part of your life going forward. And of course, there are the colleagues that you will have. Work is made by the colleagues that you have. And if you can make your colleagues your friends, then that is the key to happiness and success when teaching in China. Those of you who are going to be working for public school organizations may well have over 100 different colleagues at public schools throughout your city, throughout cities like Shenzhen and Beijing and Zhengzhou. Those of you who are going to be working at private language centers, some of you may be working at very large centralized offices, and again, have hundreds of colleagues who you're going to get to know. Some of you may be working at smaller, more remote centers and may have just 3 or 4 or 5 close Western colleagues, like I had when I first taught in China. And also the teaching assistants and Chinese colleagues that you're going to have. These are going to be the people who are going to help you throughout your time in China. These are going to be the people who are going to help you get settled, help sort you out with all of the orientation items I mentioned yesterday, but also those who are going to be with you throughout your time in China, supporting you, looking out for you, having your back. The colleagues that you'll make will be one of the most precious things that you'll take back with you from China. So let's take a brief look at the content that we're going to cover today. First of all, I'm going to give you an introduction to education in China, what it means in China. I won't be able to fully explain it. It's very much going to scratch the surface of what is a very deep and important element of Chinese culture, but it'll hopefully be able to give you a bit of a thin overview. We're then going to delve a little bit deeper into the different types of schools. I'll go into a little more detail as to what to expect in the different types of schools that you might work in. I'll then speak a little bit about foreign teachers in China, what to expect in the unique circumstance of being a foreign teacher in China, before going on to speak a little bit more about workplace etiquette, Chinese culture in the workplace, and resolving issues and problems that you may encounter. Let's take a look, first of all, at education in China. To give you an idea of how important education in China is, I can only really speak from experience. My experience of first getting a little bit of an understanding of how important education was in China was upon arrival. I was met at the airport. I was taken out to an impromptu Halloween party filled with about 100 students, most of whom I would be teaching over the next year, feeling very jet lagged and a little bit queasy after my flight. I was a little taken aback by this, but the energy that kind of surrounded me and goodwill that I felt and the welcome I received from the students and parents was absolutely enormous. And that was my first sort of sign that I'm going to be going into a role where I'm potentially going to be seen as being quite important in the lives of a lot of these kids and also a lot of these parents. The next day, I asked my teaching assistant, Rita, who had taken me to this impromptu Halloween party upon my arrival, I asked her why I was taken to it straight after getting off the plane. And her answer to that I found quite interesting. She said, well, Will, it's because education is very important in China. And teachers are very important in China for that. I was a little bit confused by that because it almost felt as if she was saying to me, well, education is important in China, therefore it's not important in your country. And I was almost a little bit put out by that comment, thinking, well, education is important in countries like Britain. Education is important in countries like the United States. As time went on, I began to see what she meant. Education in China, for many reasons that I'm going to get into quite shortly, is genuinely valued at a higher rate than any other country that I know of in the world. Parents of students will press their students to squeeze the final amounts of education that they can get out of every hour of every day, and pressure on these students is absolutely immense. There are going to be times, almost certainly, when you're teaching where you may feel guilty that you're burning a child out. But the pressure to learn, the pressure to excel, the pressure to exceed in China when it comes to education is absolutely enormous. And this is one of the reasons why these positions exist, why foreign teachers exist. Parents and education bureaus are so keen to try every different angle of education to improve student standards, which very, very much includes learning English in a native manner from native speakers, from those who have studied in universities in native speaking countries. Having that level of oral English is incredibly important. It's seen as a gap in the Chinese education system and it needs to be filled. And students will do that at school, in public schools, with these extra lessons that many of you who will be public school teachers will be putting on. And outside of school, where students can study between 10 and 12 hours a day at a time, parents will have their students attend private language centers and learn in smaller classes and spend a large amount of money to learn with native speakers there. The investment that is put financially, through effort and emotionally into education in China is absolutely enormous. And while many people think maybe that's a little OTT, well, there's quite good reason for it. And a lot of that lies in history. China has over 5,000 years of continuous civilization, and for much of that, education has been incredibly important. The idea of literacy, the idea of bettering oneself through knowledge. Confucianism is an absolute hallmark and cornerstone of that ideology. In 1949, the People's Republic of China was formed, China as we know it today. Mao Zedong was victorious in the civil war against the Kuomintang, and communist China was founded. During the initial stages of the People's Republic of China, the Communist Party largely saw areas like humanities and creative subjects as being wasteful, and indeed much of education as being quite bourgeoisie. So a lot of schools and all higher education centers were essentially shut down. Many people and many young people, teenagers, were made to take years away from education to go out into the countryside to farm, to live rurally, many of whom to live in areas that were simply not really fit for human habitation, and were taken away from education, taken away from academic betterance, to gain an understanding of what it is to be a worker, to gain an understanding of what it is to be a peasant or a proletariat. Indeed, the current leader of China, Xi Jinping, was part of this generation. He famously lived in a cave for many years as part of this. Following this and following the reform and opening up in China, there was still a broad sense that areas like creative subjects and humanities were seen as quite wasteful. And there was a similar education system enforced as the one that existed in the Soviet Union at the time, where a study of precise skills were emphasized. You had institutions that were specifically designed for very specific areas of things like engineering or things that required mathematics. STEM was very heavily pushed, and still to this day is. And a rote style of learning was enforced in China, where there is a right answer and there is a wrong answer to everything, where students sit in a line, they listen to the teacher, they listen to a solution, they don't talk to one another, they don't work out how, they just work out the method of getting the correct answer. And it's done very well for China's development, arguably incredibly well for China's development. They have been able to create an economy where they know where everything goes, where they know what the answer is at the end of every question. But what it's also done is it has created a narrow sense of understanding. And since the 1990s, this has really been picked up on in the country. And education has started to diversify. And particularly in the 21st century, and particularly throughout the 2010s, this has happened at a staggering rate. So, in order to combat that rote system, in order to combat that narrow sense of understanding that is still prevalent in China today, and that you will all experience in your everyday conversation with Chinese, both young and old. They wanted to reach out, bring on broader ideas, and importantly, travel and try to learn a new perspective with a new language, of which English, the global language, was seen as a gateway to it. Many schools in China have a saying that English is the bridge to the rest of the world. This is one of the slogans of the Chinese Communist Party under the new plan of the China Dream to create a moderately prosperous nation, to educate Chinese better, to become global citizens, and to become a leader on the global stage. As part of that, and as part of the influence of that, there are now over 300 million English language learners in China, around 5 times the entire population of the United Kingdom are currently learning English, young and old. The traditional rote system of learning is still heavily used. It takes a very long time to correct and change a system that's been so heavily entrenched in China for years and years. But it is gradually beginning to change. And foreign teachers have been brought in really to remedy this, to bring a broader understanding, to bring a more discursive and critical approach to learning a language. There's been a heavy emphasis on outward mobility in China, mostly over the last 10 years, with more and more students from China going abroad to study in countries like the United Kingdom, Australia, the United States, and more Chinese working abroad, investing in property abroad, working with transnational companies that are trying to break into the Chinese market. The failings of the entrenched rote system of learning in practical and communication has really come to the fore now. It's become very evident in China. And as China looks to cooperate, to influence, to form meaningful partnerships with the rest of the world, it requires its citizens to be able to do so from a point of critical understanding as well. And that cultural and historic dogma, the rote learning systems, the idea of there only being one right and one wrong answer, the idea of having a token response to a single question, has led to a serious communication and skill shortage from within the country. That gives you a little bit of a backdrop as to the current situation in China and a little bit of a hint as to why the skills and experience of foreign teachers and native speaking teachers are required in China at the moment. But what are the different types of institutions that need these foreign teachers to come in? Well, for the vast majority of you, it will be the top two, public schools and private schools. I'll just very briefly touch on public schools and private language centres. I'll just very briefly touch on private schools, international schools, and universities now as well to give you a broad understanding. Private schools in China are often categorised as what are called bilingual schools, where the school itself is private but is predominantly made up of Chinese students. Broadly speaking, they will learn the Chinese curriculum, but they will have around half of their lessons conducted entirely in English. Many bilingual schools will have a huge number of native speaking English teachers working in them. Some of them have half or above of the entire teachers or entire staff at the school as native speaking English teachers. They're slightly different from international schools, which will do an international curriculum as opposed to a Chinese curriculum. This might be the International Baccalaureate, it might be IGCSEs or IA levels. At international schools, they'll usually have teachers from around the world teaching their students. These teachers will teach every single subject. Broadly speaking, all of these teachers will be from native speaking countries, and 100% of their lessons, except for their Chinese language lessons, if they choose to do them, will be conducted in English. You also have universities. Now, universities are quite interesting as places where foreign teachers will be working. For the vast majority of foreign teachers, they're not lecturers who are lecturing at degree level for English, but they will be teaching elective subjects, usually for students who are looking at taking a year in their university to study abroad. And they'll be doing an elective oral English class that will be taught by a foreign teacher. These are pretty much entirely discussion-based lessons. A lot of teachers will do things like debate and critical thinking within them, and they can be quite interesting places to work. The majority of you on the Teach China graduate program will, however, be working in public schools or private language centres. These are the two most prevalent organisations for foreign teachers to work in. Public schools in China still very much have that dogma, that rote style of learning that's been entrenched in them. This is broadly because they are public schools. As China's population has moved from the countryside to the city at a very rapid rate, many schools have been built. The vast majority of you will be working at schools that will be between 2 and 10 years old. Many of you will be working at schools that will not be full yet of the students that will be attending them, because they'll have only had a couple of years being active as a school itself. These can create a quite ghostly, a quite eerie feeling where you'll have these enormous, modern, beautiful schools and structures that will only have a few hundred students in them. Some of you will have schools that will be full of students, that will have around 2,000 or 3,000 students in a primary or in a middle school. Within your classes, you can expect to find between 40 and 60 students at a public school. This can seem quite daunting at first, but foreign teachers do work with teaching assistants who are there to help them. And also it's important to remember that because of the dogma and because of the psychological impact of what schooling means and how it works for the majority of the rest of their lessons, keeping order in a Chinese classroom is not as difficult as you might think. They are already predisposed to behave themselves. They will be looking forward, but that isn't to say it is without its problems. Many of you who will be teaching at public schools will again be teaching oral English. There will be an element of rote learning to it, as there has to be with a class of between 40 and 60 students. But what you'll be doing is getting them to practice speaking. Getting them to speak with you, getting them to speak with each other, getting them to do group work, getting them, in some cases, to debate things, getting them to do teamwork, and getting them to think for themselves and categorize things for themselves using vocabulary that has been learned before, as opposed to just simply giving them questions with multiple choice answers or answers that they might have memorized before. With private language centers, you'll have much smaller classes. Now, these class sizes are generally between 1 and 10 students. The average is usually around 6 or 7, I tend to find. In these classes, it'll be a lot more intimate. You'll have much more of an opportunity to speak one-on-one and individually with each of the students. You'll also usually be responsible for speaking with many of the parents. At private language centers, you'll generally be teaching a curriculum that'll be quite plug and play, that'll be handed to you, that'll usually be developed by the school itself. If you choose to stay for a second or a third year, you may very well have a say in curriculum development for it, which is always quite exciting and fun to be able to learn from and use. Unlike public schools, you'll likely have to have quite a bit of interaction with the parents at private language centers as well, which is the daunting thing about working in these places. There are some parents who can be quite severe and quite scary, but the vast majority of parents are absolutely lovely and very helpful, and you will have a translator with the parents as well when you speak with them. What are the challenges in the classroom that you can expect to have? Well, first of all, there is excitement. This is particularly true of those of you, for those of you who will be working in primary schools. Many of these young students are going to see a foreigner. They won't see very many foreigners, even if they're living in big cities. But if you're in a smaller city, in a second tier, or even a third tier city, you may be the first foreigner that they've seen in months, years, or possibly for some of them in their entire life. This can find itself into overexcitement. Now, you will, of course, as well, be delivering very high energy, very passionate lessons where you'll be trying to pass on knowledge in a memorable and exciting manner. And this certainly doesn't help with the excitement that already comes in. So keeping a lid on things, keeping them contained, knowing when to get them speaking and when to get them up and when to get them active and when to have them sitting down. Having a having call and repeat signs where they know when to be quiet, where they know when to sit down. Having clear instruction and clear boundaries are going to be very important. And these are going to be things that you will learn in your induction when you first arrive in China, whether you're working at a public school or a private language center. There can also be a competitive environment that will rear its head in China. China is a very competitive place. A lot of that comes from the attitude that's taken towards education as being something that needs to be fed and something that needs to be learned. And children are constantly seeking to be the best. In many classes in China, children will literally be ranked, and that ranking will be visible from everyone. There'll be a child who will be number 1 at that ranking. There'll be a child who will be number 40 at that ranking. This is something that is quite hard as a Westerner to get your head around and to accept, and it feels a little wrong at first. As a foreign teacher, you generally won't be expected to rank your students, so don't worry about needing to do that. But ensuring that students are fair with each other, ensuring that students who fall behind aren't picked on, and most importantly, ensuring that students who fall behind have the attention paid to them is very, very important. Now, because of that excitement and the energy that foreign teachers' classes bring to education that are very different to that quite stale rote style of learning that they do, first of all, they may struggle to distinguish work and play. They'll think sort of calling things out or singing songs is something that, you know, is for the boundary, is within the boundaries of playtime, not within a school context. And then on the other side, you've got the pressure that students can feel, that massive pressure that comes from their parents, that comes from society, that comes from the importance that is placed on education. There are students who, when they fail to do something, may react in a very negative way, may cry, may feel very sad, may feel excluded. And when you've got a class of 40 to 60 students, you know, hey, what are you going to do about that situation? Your teaching assistants will be there to help you with this. But again, these are going to be struggles that you will encounter in your classes. Then, of course, there are the students who are going to be shy and insulated can feel almost isolated from the rest of the class. And at the other end, the strong, bold, and loud characters that will exist as well. What's most important is that the strongest, boldest, and loudest character is you. The character who has the most authority is you. The character who gets to choose who to speak and when they speak is you. In China, there can sometimes be a propensity for teachers to focus only on the strongest students, with an idea that all of the others will listen to the strongest student and learn from them. It's important to keep a liberal and open atmosphere where students feel confident to be able to answer questions and set down those rules in the first place. Then, of course, there are the parents. Now, this is very much going to be for those of you who are at private language centers above public schools. You will sometimes be required to give regular feedback. When I say sometimes, those of you working in private language centers, this will be after almost every single lesson. Those of you in public schools, you may have things like parents' evenings or drop-in sessions. Some of you may never have to deal with parents ever at all. Parents can have very high expectations of their children. As I've alluded to already, as I'm sure you've guessed, they are going to be, on the whole, a lot stricter and more severe with their kids than they are in the West. You see down here, one of the big examples of what I find is the biggest difference between West and East are the parents on the right, Westerners who will blame the teacher for the bad grades of their students, parents on the left who will blame their child for their own bad grades. Very often Chinese parents fall into the category on the left. They can sometimes fall into the category on the right, as I've certainly experienced, but broadly speaking, they fall into the ones on the left. Now, this can leave you in a bit of an uneasy feeling, especially if you are working in a private language center and you immediately see a parent scold a child after a lesson if you've given bad feedback. It's important to gauge this and to remember and to think what you're going to be saying to the parents too. In tomorrow's session, we'll be taking a look at Chinese etiquette and how to raise problems and how to address problems correctly in China without stoking severe emotions, shall we say. So it's important to take this into account when speaking with Chinese parents. But again, these are going to be things that you will experience as a teacher in China. Well, let's open it up now to any questions that you might have on from our introduction to education in China, any of the struggles that you might have, anything that you feel you might experience that might be tough for you. I'll give you about a minute just to pop any questions in there before moving on. Okay, moving on now then. Foreign teachers in China. What does it mean to be a foreign teacher in China? Well, first of all, let's take a look at what the purpose of a foreign teacher in China actually is, the reason why you're there. Again, following my introduction, a little bit of information on the Chinese education system, you may very well have been able to gauge and put together exactly the reasons why foreign teachers are required in China. But as a simple breakdown of their purpose, it's to assist and practice communication. For students who are very rarely exposed to native English speaking individuals, the ability to be able to practice communication in a fluid and natural way is vitally important for a global facing China, and a China that is looking to have its young generation play an important role in the world as we go forward. Another important reason for foreign teachers to be brought in is to build confidence in students who may not otherwise have it. Teachers in China have been trained, as students are taught, in a very dogmatic manner, in a very disciplinarian manner. So being able to build confidence, being able to praise, being able to have that experience as a child of a foreigner, of a native speaker, telling them that they've said something really well, or they've done something the right way, they've pronounced a word the correct manner, is so valuable to them. And it cannot be understated how valuable that is, or how well they will take that compliment. To aid critical and individual thought. Now, this is really important. And I actually think that this is the most important purpose of a foreign teacher in China. Again, education in China is based around getting a right answer. And there only being one right answer, and there only being one formula to get that right answer. But when it comes to discussion, when it comes to thinking about things, when it comes to communication in English, there are a lot of grey areas. Opinion matters, individuality matters, being able to think for yourself matters when it comes to practical communication in English. When we hear someone parroting words that have been learnt and taught and memorized before, we tend to be distrustful of it. We tend to think, oh, you know, I'm not sure how to react with that. It tends to be somewhat more unnatural. In China, the entire system of learning is through memorization. The entire system of learning to read the language, a series of hundreds of thousands of very complex symbols, is done through memorizing. Each word in Chinese is a single syllable long that is put together to create a logical whole word in itself. Critical thought when it comes to language, thinking critically when it comes to language, is something that really is quite a new concept, and you'll be able to bring that to them, because in China at the moment, the English language is very much taught as they will teach the Chinese language, which simply isn't the way it should be. It's also to improve pronunciation and grammar. In China, there's a lot of what's called mislearning, where because China has been an insulated country for so long, teachers who are teaching students have very often not even really been to a native speaking English country. Many of them have never had a fluid conversation with a native speaker themselves. And there can be a lot of mislearning that happens and is then passed on to students as well. So improving that pronunciation and grammar is vitally, vitally important going forward. To create an immersive and cultural experience from an early age. Again, as China becomes a global facing country, a country that takes the lead in globalization, giving students in a country that is still very homogenous a cultural experience of being able to interact with someone from somewhere very different is going to be vitally important. And for those who are younger, to introduce business English, to introduce things like negotiation in the English language from an early age will be vitally important as well. And of course, with these purposes come a lot of personality expectations. Teachers in China are generally expected to be engaging, high energy and fun, able to create that immersive environment I spoke about earlier, able to infuse their students with a passion for wanting to learn. They're able to take a differentiated approach. They're able to look at different students and the different needs that they will have to be able to pick out the students that are struggling and bring confidence out of them. They're expected to be dedicated, as well as cultured and intelligent, to know about a range of different areas that students may not have had access to before, or may not have been disposed to before. Not only students, but parents may not have had before, and to be able to interweave these with the rest of their lessons, to bring up new and exciting concepts and ideas and things from our own country to introduce to them. Then, of course, there are the practical expectations that will be placed on you as a teacher in China. You'll be expected to have your lessons planned well in advance. You'll be expected to log your students' progress and do all sorts of other administrative duties like this. Now, in China, you will certainly be expected to be flexible and ready to adapt to last-minute changes. This is the bane and life of the majority of foreign teachers when they come to China, the here and now nature of China, the cut and thrust, the fast changes that can occur, the seeming disorganization that potentially comes with that. You've got to be ready on a minute's notice to be able to pull up a lesson plan on your USB and go in and do that lesson and deliver it with gusto. And you've got to be able to put the interests of the school first in that sense, as well as to keep office harmony and keep a good relationship with your colleagues around you. If you pull for them, they will pull for you, and it creates a great sense of camaraderie. Remember, China is a country that is based on being communitarian, based on everyone coming together as a whole, as opposed to a group of individuals. We'll speak about that a little more in a moment when we speak about potential workplace conflicts and dealing with issues. But does anyone have any questions just at the moment on those aspects of being a foreign teacher in China? Okay, moving on. Cultural awareness at work. Being culturally aware at work is going to be very important for you living, working, and teaching in China, as it is in your social life. Being aware of those cultural aspects like mianzi or face is very important, especially when it comes to figures of authority. Being careful about what you say and how you say it is also going to be incredibly important as well. As well as remembering that China is that communitarian culture, where individualism isn't viewed as highly as pulling for one another and creating an environment where everyone knows they can rely on each other no matter what. Workplace etiquette is very closely related to cross-cultural understanding. And in China, flexibility and adaptability, willingness to be able to engage with, contribute, and help out that whole, that group of people pulling together is very important. It's also important to remember the cultural concept we spoke about yesterday of mianzi or face, to interpret real meaning behind comments and situations, to ensure that you're humble, to ensure that you're complimentary, almost more so than you would be in countries like the UK at times. Yes, of course, things like banter exist in China between people once they get to know each other, but it's usually when a relationship is much more strongly formed. When you're in China, you can expect to receive a huge amount of compliments about things. And it can sometimes make you feel a little uneasy, but remember that is how relationships are established in China, and it's that giving face. And it's also sometimes a reason to think, well, if my boss is complimenting me so much, what else is he saying in this? Very often to me, when my boss wanted to mark an area of improvement for me, in order to not offend me, because I hadn't done anything to offend him yet, or hadn't done anything wrong, he'd be very complimentary to me about all kinds of things and say just one slight little sentence in there. It'd be very easy to miss it or forget it, but that one little sentence was the thing that he really wanted to talk to me about, the area that he really wanted me to improve on. So remembering and thinking when you're being complimented at work by a figure of authority, to listen out for that area of improvement and not miss out on that, because that's something that can cause misunderstanding down the line. Remembering hierarchy and authority as well. China is a country that takes hierarchy and authority incredibly seriously. China has 5,000 years of it. 5,000 years, the majority of which have been ruled by dynasties with a very clear chain of command that goes down in China, and that has very much been followed on into China as the People's Republic. Many people called Mao the Red Emperor. Many people see Xi Jinping as being essentially an emperor in all but name. There is that chain of authority that goes down. And it can sometimes be quite frustrating asking a colleague at work if they can do something, because they will need to go and ask the person above them in the chain, who will need to ask the person above them in the chain, the person above them in the chain to do something. It can take very, very long to find things out or to get things done in China at times. Whereas if something needs to be done now, the person at the top of the chain will say, oh, actually, we need to do something in 10 minutes time. And they'll very quickly pass down the chain of authority, fall into your lap, and you will need to deliver a class at 5 minutes notice because the person at the top has done that. Remembering that hierarchy, authority, and communitarian aspect of teaching in China is incredibly important, because it can at times be frustrating, but it is always rewarded, whether it's rewarded with holidays, with time off. I got an all expenses paid trip to Hong Kong for working a few times outside of my hours, for doing a few special classes that those in authority had asked me to do. I had been given countless amounts of banquets and free meals and time off and more than time off in lieu than I'd served in excess. So remembering that give and take that exists in China is incredibly important too, and that relationships work in that way. Yes, there is that short-term nature, those aspects of here and now, and seeming disorganization that can be jarring and jolting, especially if you're coming from a Western culture. But there are the rewards that you don't receive in a Western culture as well, that you will receive as part of that in China. Of course, another thing that's important to remember sort of generally in life is avoiding office gossip, avoiding falling out with colleagues. Remember, you're going to be there for a year. And in that year, you are going to have very intense relationships, especially with other foreign teachers in China. There are countless number of foreign teachers who I've seen leave China on bad terms with people around them because they've not been flexible or accepting of other expats and foreign teachers, let alone Chinese staff. So remembering to go into things with an open mind, to go into relationships with people with an open mind, and to be very understanding of people and problems that they might have in what can be at times very tense situations. Of course, there's resolving issues. When it comes to resolving issues in China, it's important to remember those concepts of face. Now, having something out with someone in a public place, having an argument with someone in front of other colleagues is never nice. It's never nice in the West, but I'm sure pretty much all of you will have seen it. In China, it is very taboo. It's incredibly important, no matter how minor the situation or gripe or grievance, that you set up a discussion in private with it. Be particularly sensitive when dealing with figures of authority. It's never a good idea to have an out-and-out argument with a figure of authority, but a discussion. Finding compromise, finding something where you can come to an agreement. Being respectful and diplomatic is incredibly important. Remember, you're only there for a short period of time. Make the most of it. Create good relationships. Be respectful and diplomatic. Avoid confrontation, and confrontation can be avoided in the vast majority of situations. In China, mediation is far more common than litigation, and certainly far more common than escalation. Even in a criminal circumstance in China, generally, if something has happened, if a dispute has happened between people, even if it's turned violent, the first thing that police will do will take them to a tea house to sit them down and to discuss it and to come to a compromise or a common solution before going into anything more serious. This is something that is really important in China, and to bear in mind when you're having discussions with them. There is always compromise that can be reached. You can really see this in the lowest form when it comes to people acting one-on-one over a dispute, to the very highest form with the current trade war that's happening between China and the United States. Having an understanding of Chinese culture and being open to that discussion and that mediation is vitally important to create a good relationship and a good feeling in China going forward. Causing authority figures to lose face is never a good idea, will never lead to a good solution, and will certainly never lead to a resolution as well. So again, thinking about that aspect of face, thinking about how you can pay respect, thinking about how you can come to a compromise in a meaningful way is vitally important. Does anyone have any questions now about cultural awareness at work? Okay, fantastic. Well, in which case, tomorrow we will be looking at life outside of work, Chinese culture and immersion. We're going to be looking at the history of China. We're going to be looking at what you can expect on the street in China. We're going to be looking at some of the troubles you might find. We'll be looking at VPNs, getting across the Great Firewall. We'll be looking at situations that you have that might potentially seem a little scary or a little worrying. We'll be tackling a few thorny issues about Chinese society, culture, security, and politics. And we will be going over also some of the wonderful things that you can expect to see and expect to do in China as well. But for today, thank you very much once again for joining me, and look forward to speaking with you again tomorrow. Thank you very much and good evening.